Welcome back. So I'm going to press play here and I'm going to clear these out. If you haven't figured it out yet, if you've been following along, every time you make changes to the class system, it looks like you've got to change this. If there's a inconsistency in the structure of the class, then the data won't load or save. So every time you add or delete something, you're going to have to restart the scene from scratch. So I'm just going to do that right now. Just populate some random stats for the character, get these bonus points down to 0, and start the journey. So you'll notice right here we have what I've made is an enemy. There are 3 enemies running around, and when we save and load, they will respawn. Um, so let me break down what's going on here. The enemies don't do anything. This is just the scripting for creating them, keeping track of them in the scene, and eventually keeping track of their stats between saves. So let's go into the code. We've added a few new classes in the classes script. So there's current scene, which is a class that's being held on the current scene. It's not saved, but we'll get into that. Then there's SceneEnemy, which for current scene is the information for the in-game enemy. I've learned a couple things. You can't save a game object or a vector 3. So positions are going to have to be a string that we turn into a vector 3 later, same with rotation. And then enemy is a public class that does not get saved because it's got game objects. So this is the one that we just hold data. So in our scene here, let me bring in the prefab of control objects. You'll notice under master command and beyond game, we also have the class for enemies here, and then we have 2 enemies. Now this is not something that's saved. This is our database, if you will. Every enemy you have, you can add right here. It's got its own ID based on enemies.enemy ID number. It's got a name. The prefab in my prefabs folder. Let me expand that out a little bit. There's enemy controllers and enemy prefabs. So it's the link to the prefab. The hit points maximum, hit points that it starts with should be the same. Gold minimum, gold max, those are when it dies and the player picks it up, the random number of gold between the two. So I've got enemy 1 and 2. And those are stored there. And then under game here, I no longer have an enemy thing under the game. Instead, each scene has an enemies list, and it's actually a list. It's not an array. This was a little bit of a pain to set up, but let's check out what this does. You'll notice in SceneEnemy here, we have this function to add an entry into the list. So it adds the entry, it gets the new enemy data. That's from the database enemy up here that can hold the prefab and all that, and a control ID. That's the game object controller ID, and it populates this. So the whole the way it works is inside populate the scene, which happens when the scene is loaded. If the game has not yet been saved, then we're going to do this code right here, which is first we're going to set up the list for our current scene. So game scene current scene ID dot enemies is a new list, and I guess I should also point out in scene data here we have our scene is the current scene class. So that's down here, and current scene just has enemy controller, an array, and an array of enemies, which I believe we don't use anymore. Yeah, so I'm going to delete that now. So we have enemy controller, an array for those, and inside that we have one listing for each enemy controller. So that's something you'll have to populate yourself. Just drag over each one. I put the enemy controllers under here. Now these are prefabs as well, enemy controllers. I'm skipping around a lot, so I apologize if that's confusing. Watch the video again, I guess. The enemy controller script has all these things. The in-game ID, that's the in-game ID of the model in the master control enemies right here. And then it also has the in-game model that's going to link to the actual game object. The controller ID, that's the ID it is in this list right here. So 0, 1, and 2. There's no way for I mean, you can just put them in any order, but there's no way unless you want to hard code it to get that data. So instead, I just pass it along when I do the for each loop. So that's a link to that ID. Enemy number is used for the enemy's prefab list, I believe. Yeah. So the idea is that perhaps you want your game, every time the characters respawn, the enemies respawn, you want them to be slightly harder. You can actually have a list of enemies so that every time it respawns, this goes up by 1, and at the end it will just repeat. Now I haven't fully put in that logic yet, but that's what enemy number refers to. So it starts out at 0, which means it's going to do test enemy. The concept is that when the scene respawns with new enemies, it will now do this one, which is test enemy as well. And the third time it respawns, it will use test enemy 2, which is a slightly harder enemy. That way the game can be kept, I guess if people go back to the same scene later, they can experience a slightly different challenge than they had the first time. So that's what that does. So let's go back here. So if the game has not been saved, we're going to set up the list for game, scene number, and enemies. And if the scene data script scene enemy controller length, is if there's enemy controllers that you've assigned to that class over in the scene data. If there are some, then for each one, get the enemy controller ID. That's going to be 0 through whatever. The control object is scene data script dot scene dot enemy controller with the ID dot controller, which links directly to the object that holds enemy control. And we're going to call initial populate and pass along its ID so it knows its ID. Initial populate over here assigns its ID to controller ID. And then it calls master control add new enemy, and it passes along the prefab name, which is going to be this held in the database as well. So we just need to pass along the prefab name. Enemy number is, of course, the enemy number we're currently on, and it starts out at 0. It passes along this game object, this script specifically, and the controller ID, which we did just pass here, but we're going to use in the next function as well, which is add new enemy. That's back on master. It's a very simple function here. We take in our variables that we just passed. So our new enemy, it's going to be of the class enemy, equals enemies.enemy lookup get ID by the enemy name. Remember, this is our helper function that allows us to use enemy names instead of IDs, so we don't have to remember the actual ID of every enemy. So we can just call up goblin or green dragon and look up the ID. So enemies enemy, get that enemy that we passed here, and then we're going to add. Add is a command for the list. So our current scene, our enemies list, we're going to add to that a new scene enemy, which is slightly different from the enemy because it can be saved. We're going to pass this data, the entire data from that enemy in our little database that we made. We're going to pass that as well as the scene control ID, which is that EC variable that we had. And then we're going to ask the control script again now to create the enemy. So the population, this part gets populated in here. Master control. This will now be populated with the new enemy, and then we're going to create the enemy, and we're passing along the ID of this enemy. And to get that, and remember this is a new enemy, so an enemy that has not yet been added. So for every one that's added, the number, the count here for this list will go up by 1. And so the ID for the first one will be 0, which is the count minus 1. So we're passing along basically the ID of the enemy, of the instance of the enemy inside our scene class right here. So let's look at create enemy in our enemy control. That's right here. Here's our new ID. So this gives us our in-game ID, and that's a way that we can now call from this script. We can contact the enemy model directly, or the data for the enemy directly. Our in-game model, which is we're going to instantiate right now. We're going to instantiate with the enemy prefab for the enemy number. We're going to instantiate at this position, quaternity on identity. I still don't know what that really means, but everyone says that's what you do, and it always works. So, and so that's our in-game model and our in-game ID. Change the name to match the name of the prefab. That gets rid of the clone that Unity adds. And then we're going to turn the capsule collider to false and the renderer to be false. I should probably make the collider, just remove that already, but I haven't yet. And the renderer I like to keep so that when I'm editing the scene I can see where the enemies will show up, so we'll just turn that off. That's pretty much there is for the initial populate. That happens only when the scene has not been loaded before. Now, if we go back to our master function, if the scene has been loaded, we're going to do this. It basically goes through the scene enemies, which is right here. Now, since we've saved and loaded this, all this will be populated with all those enemies. They're not going to be in the scene yet, but the data for them, which we will end up saving with any hit point loss, and all of that will be saved right here. So all we need to do is go through that list for each one, as long as it's not empty. For each one, we're going to get the control ID, which has been saved with the with this enemy data. We're going to get the spawning object, which is the controller, the enemy controller. Again, it was the way we're going to call that, and since we don't have an easy way to look it up, especially since there's going to be multiple ones with multiple names, that's why we need this ID. The scene data script .scene.enemy controller control ID, which was saved, that's the controller we're going to use. So we're going to tell that controller to spawn, and we're going to pass along these two variables. Spawn is the ID of the enemy, and this I believe is, let's just double check, go back to our enemy control spawn, that is our enemy data, which is SceneEnemy. That's the stuff that's saved. And basically we do the same thing we did for the create enemy, but with the data we already saved. So the one thing we're going to have to do here is populate the stats and statuses and whatnot of the enemy we saved, so that if they were in a certain position or rotation, we'll set that here. If they have less hit points or have maybe a freeze spell cast on them and they can't move, we'll do that here, and we'll set them all up in this function. So that's it for the start of the enemy control scripting. Things might get cleaned up in the future, but it's working right now. You can try it yourself. Just make sure to start a new game from the game menu in order to test it out. But if you do that, it should work just fine. So let me know what you think.